So it contains an immense amount, this museum contains an immense amount of information. It's a signal success of the design that it presents so much detail in such a limited space. There's no attempt to simplify this. But again, we have to remember that the Poles that are going through this are first of all, many of the students are going through with their teachers. They've been learning about this in class. So in some way they're going through with a guide in many cases. And in those cases, it's not a lot. They have the necessary context. The exhibits are in Polish, English, and German. And guide materials are available in Russian and French. Nevertheless, unlike the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, where nearly all the visitors have at least some basic understanding of the nature of the Holocaust, it's questionable whether the museum, as it's designed, can successfully educate foreign visitors, most of whom have little or no prior knowledge of the Rising, perhaps only a hazy idea of the conditions in wartime Poland outside of the Holocaust. Nor is it always clear how the portrayal of the Rising in the exhibits will provide a coherent forum for public remembrance and discussion among future generations of Poles. They don't really have a postmodern approach, but they don't give you a clear picture of what happened. I mean, I as a historian, knowing the event I often got frustrated at some points of like, well, they missed this, or they explained something that was sort of not in chronological order someplace else in the museum. For example, the very first part as you walk through is, you can't really understand the heroism, the tragedy of the uprising unless you have a detailed knowledge of the period of occupation that existed before the uprising. And yet that period is dealt with only briefly in the first 4 or 5 displays. And these areas also include information on the fate of Warsaw Jews, the ghetto uprising, and the structure of the Polish underground state. So all of that information is crammed into the first couple sections. So a casual visitor with limited knowledge might wonder why the city's inhabitants fought with such ferocious courage. If Warsaw's occupation is made to seem little different from those of other major European cities captured by Hitler's armies. Now, there's a recently added section on the German occupying authorities, but that's consigned to the basement, and that was recently opened. And so it's really not, so in a sense, you get that part after you go through everything else. The museum downplays actual descriptions of combat and some of the grislier atrocities committed by German forces. Instead, there's a strong emphasis on civilian life, survival during the Rising, and the fate of non-combatants. Although these topics are quite important and deserve the attention they receive, many of the most dramatic scenes of the 63-day struggle are handled in an almost offhand kind of way. This stems from a decision by the designers to provide a multiplicity of views rather than a central narrative of events. The museum functions much like an oral history collection. Many of the accounts, especially brief biographies of the young citizen soldiers who perished in the unequal struggle, are beautiful and moving. However, it's weak in terms of providing coherent information on the Rising. For the foreign visitor without deep knowledge of modern Polish history, it's almost necessary to read a history of the Rising prior to visiting in order to benefit from the experience. So the Museum of the Warsaw Rising stands as a memorial. This is partly the strength of its function. It's almost like a temple of memory. And they actually have a chapel in there. And this is by the way, I'll come back to this in a second. Here's the wall of memory. It lists the names of many of those killed in the uprising. The chapel is dedicated to the Blessed Father Joseph Stanek, who was a priest who was executed by the SS as he was attempting to negotiate a surrender of a group of civilians. But this museum as a memorial is a function of the post-communist culture and politics. For 45 years, this most central event of the Polish wartime experience was denounced as a fascist plot, and alternately belittled or ignored. Discussion of the Soviet alliance and with Nazi Germany between 1939 and 41, communist terror and oppression, and things like Katyn, for example, were ignored or forbidden. Because of this, the museum dedicates one part of the exhibit to the role played by the Soviets and Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. The main section on the Soviet role, the Polish puppet government, is found in a red-tinged hallway with nice red lights. You can kind of see it. I don't know, turn off the light a little bit more, but you can see it's all, pretty much everything is painted red. There's some other sections where they deal with little related topics. There's a section on the Polish-controlled Soviet army. And lastly, the museum contains sections on post-war distortion of the Rising by communist authorities in Poland and the Soviet Union, and the persecution and murder of leading pro-independence activists. Because subjects related to the Soviet Union were so heavily censored and suppressed for so long, it's actually these parts of the museum that are the most effective, in my opinion. The Museum of the Warsaw Rising thus functions as a kind of temple of memory, in which the traditional educative function of the displays is subordinated to the need to recover and come to terms with one of the most traumatic events in Polish history. It's almost like a sort of mass therapy session. Creating a kind of narrative retelling of the Rising, which would be most helpful to foreign audiences and perhaps future generations of Poles, is less important than the museum as memorial. Indeed, most Poles, even classes of school children, arrive at the museum with all or part of the context necessary to interpret the displays, and thus the disjointed nature of many of the sections of the museum presents less of a barrier. Nevertheless, again, foreign visitors will have a great deal of problem with this. This is to be understood. So in a sense, the question is why do they spend so much time worrying about foreign visitors? Why do they translate everything into all these different languages? And it's just looking through the gift shop, it was my estimate that about a quarter of all the materials in the gift shop were actually in English or in some other bilingual, or in English or in a language other than Polish. They had some in German and some in French as well. So why do they spend so much time on this topic for the foreign visitor? And this can be understood, I think, as a peculiarity of Polish historical memory. As a sort of moderate, small-sized country, Poles feel their past is both important and worthy of remembrance, in the sense that history is largely ignored or forgotten outside of Poland. This leaves a sense of wounded pride and a desire to educate visitors about the crucial aspects of the Polish past. These feelings, while often expressed awkwardly, are not illegitimate. Poland, after all, played a critical part in World War II. It contributed large numbers of more troops to the fight against Nazism than France, suffered proportionally more than any other country as a result of the war. And afterward, it now regained functional independence for almost a further half-century. The Warsaw Rising is an important prelude to the Cold War, and for many in the U.S. and Great Britain, Stalin's response to the uprising helped throw cold water on rosy notions of peaceful post-war coexistence. During the war, the Poles had vigorously opposed the Soviets, considering them little better than the Nazis, a view that in Western intellectual circles during the Cold War was routinely dismissed as reactionary. Nevertheless, the general scholarly consensus has come around, no matter how grudgingly, for the very view that the Poles had espoused in 1944. The Museum of the Warsaw Rising's appeal to foreign visitors thus fits with a larger project of attempting to rebuild a coherent historical memory of the darkest period in Polish history marked by both trauma and heroism. The museum's awkward but often moving approach to the memory of the Rising and its tragedy in World War II in Poland is symbolic of this complex yet incomplete nature of recovering the nation's past. And I think if you look at the developments in Poland, political developments in Poland over the past 10 years, you can really sort of see this drawn out, a lot of the debates that are going on. This notion, particularly this notion of the two enemies. Poland had two enemies during the Second World War. It wasn't just one enemy in Europe during the Second World War, but two. And in fact, in the European Parliament quite recently, the Polish delegation has successfully sponsored a resolution essentially equating communist crimes, with Soviet crimes in particular, with Nazi crimes. These are essentially, this was done with no little amount of debate, although, you know, it's not a law or anything like that. It doesn't have any sort of practical meaning, but it's kind of symbolic. It's very important for Poles to get this done. The role of the Soviet Union also opens up the role of security services due to how the security services treated the AK and its veterans after the war. And this is sort of folds into the larger question of collaboration, because after all, many of these people were denounced. And this, again, you know, is an entree into the question of lustration, which is still a very, you know, important and hot topic in Poland, and how this is going to be handled, how the archives are going to be opened, how they're going to be used. The recent controversy over the book on Lech Wałęsa, for example, is a really fine example of this. You know, this notion that he had been signed on to some collaboration in the early 1970s, not during the Solidarity period, with the security services, and then later, you know, went on to lead the trade union movement. Obviously, this affects relations with Russia. I mean, what's the number one sticking point? You know, if you see in the public all this discussion, you know, in Polish-Russian relations after the missile controversy and everything, it's Katyn. And then the Poles and the Russians are still going back and forth. And in fact, Putin, quite I think correctly, although, you know, I'm not the opposite of a fan of Vladimir Putin, has kind of come to some acknowledgement that he hasn't quite said we did this.